We are now joined via Zoom by Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg, Professor of Sociology. Professor Bond, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Nati. Good to be with you.
Prof, what do you make of this telephonic call to President Putin by President Ramaphosa? We're obviously hearing that President Ramaphosa actually initiated this conversation. You know, we know already that South Africa has emphasized its importance to be neutral in this situation, further stating that the conflict in Eastern Europe should be resolved through mediation and negotiations between the two parties. So what message does this telephonic call send in the face of the widespread condemnation that we are seeing and ongoing humanitarian crisis?
I think partly it's that nostalgia for the point in time in our history when Moscow was incredibly important to the African National Congress in the 60s, 70s, right through the point at which in the late 80s, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, and F.W. de Klerk coming in as a president in 1989, recognizing that support for the ANC from the Soviet Union would no longer continue. And that's when Russia made this big switch and became neoconservative. Boris Yeltsin worked very much in a kind of US free market image. And then, of course, in 1999, when Yeltsin was failing, he chose Vladimir Putin to come in. And until really a couple of years ago, well, you could say with the BRICS around 2010, we didn't really see very much action between the two countries. And it was really with the Rosatom nuclear deal, which kind of came to culmination in 2014. If you recall, the then President Zuma had gone to get antidotes for poisoning and signed off on 1.5 trillion rand worth of nuclear. And the failure to follow through with that, civil society activists halted it in the courts. But also, do you remember in 2018, when Putin did come to South Africa for the BRICS meeting, he was trying to push to reestablish that deal. And President Ramaphosa's easy answer was, at the right time, at the right pace, when we have enough money. So holding off Rosatom has been, in a sense, the single most difficult thing for President Ramaphosa to do with this old ally, and with the way in which particularly Ramaphosa leans to the West on foreign policy, allowed Naledi Pandor to initially condemn the invasion and to call for Russia to withdraw its troops, and now leaving him in a very uncomfortable position because his own ANC and to some extent Communist Party had a lot more, let's say, favorability towards the Russian side. And I think this is where in the Security Council, as the Russians claim that the US and Ukraine have been involved in biochemical warfare preparations in Ukraine, which they deny, we will see more of these diplomatic, tangles come to a head.
But in the face of the humanitarian crisis, Prof, I mean, with some suggesting this war was always an attack on civilians. I mean, as it stands now, we know that more than 2 million people have fled Ukraine in a space of just 2 weeks. Should the South African government not be sending out perhaps a stronger message, especially if we are starting to talk about mediation in this particular instance?
Yes, Sunati, I think that's absolutely right, especially because, on the one hand, President Ramaphosa does have a plausible history, say in Northern Ireland, of getting involved in negotiations. But South Africa certainly should be thinking about the potential for offering material aid. And we have really one of the very finest emergency relief agencies in the world, Gift of the Givers, that does this sort of thing, goes all over the world in a neutral way and finds ways to keep people alive who would otherwise die. An incredibly impressive organization. But of course, South Africa, as a BRICS member, is technically in this kind of club. They meet again in September in China, and I'm sure it's going to be extremely uncomfortable. You see, what Ramaphosa's also juggling is uneven investment and trade relationships, in which, for example, we have fruit and vegetable sales to Russia. We probably do a few bits of machinery and all, but it's really our investors. And the biggest one in the stock market, of course, is the Process Naspers combination. And they had, until they wrote off last week, 12 billion rand in a sort of a Russian internet service, mail.ru. Then there's also SAB Miller, now called Anheuser-Busch, with allies there, with Mondi with a big plant there, with Barlow World with machine sales and a plant there. So we do have a few of these connections, which as Russia melts down, as the BRICS New Development Bank even pulls out of Russia, as a potential default on the Russian foreign debt now looms, it looks like some of the economic relationships that have, tied Russia into the West and then by implication into South Africa are really ripping apart.
Now, we know that South Africa, through Ramaphosa, has been asked to play a mediation role. Who has asked that? We actually don't know that as yet. But given that when we talk mediation, we're talking about really two parties, coming together to find solutions. So now that this conversation has happened with Putin, I mean, should we not likely see a similar kind of engagement with the Ukrainian leader from the South African government? How would it all work if South Africa had to intervene? We know that South Africa is very good at mediating. And also, in his personal capacity, President Ramaphosa has also been sent to a number of countries to mediate.
Yeah, I mean, look, a cynic will say, who would really have the capacity and bring in President Ramaphosa or his envoys like Naledi Pandor? Who would really bring them in at the point where it's such a difficult situation right now? There's just, massive bombing of cities, even of hospitals, of psychiatric clinics, of maternity wards by Putin's forces. And the Ukrainians don't really have any way to fight back. There's no, in a sense, balance here. The real balance is with the West, and they have this extraordinary leverage, which I think surprised everyone, myself included, just about how much they have wrecked the Russian economy and seized assets. The oligarchs, for example, maybe $15 billion of their assets abroad, some $350 billion of the Russian reserves abroad seized by the West. So being thrown out of SWIFT, which is the international financial transaction system. And it does seem to me that if there is going to be any solution, that, what people are talking about is fairly obvious, that the Crimea, the southern part of Ukraine, which Putin's forces annexed in 2014, and Ukraine's never recognized that capture. It's mostly Russian speakers, and it's around the Sevastopol port, which is very important for the Russian Navy. Second, the Donbass region, that's the eastern side where there had been already rebels, Russian speaking, and a big chunk of that had already sort of split off and become ungovernable and wasn't really even in Ukraine. And my guess is that whatever happens, if it's soon, could involve simply recognizing that. There's a Minsk agreement that would extend some of the autonomy, but I suspect that Vladimir Putin simply would only concede to just a takeover. He's really run up against more opposition than he thought. He's certainly run up against the sanctions that are more difficult. So he may well be in the mood to negotiate at some point. On the other hand, if we're wrong, and we've been wrong about Putin so far, about how far he's willing to go, he really wants to clear out the Zelensky government. And then I don't think there's anything that mediation could do. If he's as sort of bloody-minded and as really brutal as the last few days have shown, he won't settle until Ukraine has a new government that's just a sort of a puppet government of Moscow.
Prof, as we wrap, we've also run out of time, but very, very quickly, perhaps let me squeeze in this last question. The UN Security Council has today scheduled a meeting at Russia's request now to discuss claims that Ukraine is running chemical and biological labs with the US support. Your thoughts on these allegations by Russia, and also US intelligence suggesting Russia is planning chemical attack on the Ukraine?
It's the fog of war, isn't it? You simply can't tell what to believe. For example, if the United States said we had nothing to do with the Wuhan lab where the coronavirus emerged from, we would have believed it initially. But it turned out they had a lot to do with it. There was a lot of co-financing. When the United States said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons or biological weapons, well, for quite a while, people believed that, and they allowed the US to go in 2003, and they couldn't find any. And so one of the things Putin has done is restored a certain kind of credibility to the US State Department, ironically, because, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, had been warning about this invasion. And frankly, because of this history of the US lying, we had not really given it any credibility. It's hard to say, but if the US and Ukraine were doing something with biochemical warfare, it wouldn't surprise anyone, would it? And yet the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has himself been caught up in all sorts of, let's say, propagandistic or fog of war lies about the way in which Ukraine's being destroyed. He simply denies it, doesn't even acknowledge that they've gone in an invasion. So we're dealing with, don't trust either side, I'm afraid.
Prof Bond, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate your analysis.
Thank you, Anati.
All right, Professor Patrick Bond there from the University of Johannesburg. He's the Professor of Sociology. Let's continue here.